Picture this scene, and let me ask you to witness it with the unflinching gaze of psychological truth. You observe a man of evident quality, successful, articulate, generous in spirit. He encounters a woman who embodies what society deems desirable, intelligent, beautiful, sought after by many. Watch as he extends himself in gestures of appreciation. Flowers appear, elaborate evenings unfold, messages of affection flow like clockwork. He believes himself to be demonstrating love through action, following the conscious script society has written for masculine devotion. Yet beneath this theater of romance, something far more ancient and mysterious begins to unfold. Her initial spark of interest dims like a candle slowly suffocating under glass. The very gestures meant to kindle her passion serve instead to extinguish it. This man, for all his conscious good intentions, remained blind to the shadow forces operating beyond the reach of rational understanding. What you are witnessing is not mere preference or fickleness, but the manifestation of psychological laws as immutable as gravity itself. These laws operate in the realm Jung called the collective unconscious, that vast repository of ancestral wisdom and primal programming that influences our deepest attractions and repulsions without our conscious awareness. The woman's cooling desire represents not a failure of his character, but his misunderstanding of the archetypal forces that truly govern feminine psychology. He has mistaken the persona, the social mask for what he believes women want, for the deeper anima, that eternal feminine principle that responds to entirely different stimuli. In the depths of every woman's psyche lies what we might call the evolutionary shadow, programming forged across millennia survival, where choosing the wrong mate meant not merely disappointment, but death itself. This shadow doesn't respond to flowers and kind words. It responds to something far more primal, the recognition of superior psychological strength. When our well-meaning suitor showers her with predictable affection, he activates not her attraction circuitry, but her psychological dismissal mechanisms. His behavior triggers ancient recognition patterns that categorize him as what Jung might call the eternal pure eternus, the eternal boy seeking motherly approval rather than standing as a masculine force capable of providing psychological shelter in life's storms. The cool irony reveals itself. His very attempt to demonstrate worthiness communicates unworthiness at the deepest level. Each eager text message, each rearranged schedule, each desperate attempt to please broadcasts a signal that echoes through her unconscious mind. I am grateful merely for your attention. And gratitude, while noble in consciousness, reads a scarcity in the language of the unconscious. Consider the shadow figure that haunts every woman's romantic imagination, not the cool brute that surface psychology suggests, but the man who carries himself with what Jung called individuation. This figure doesn't seek her approval because he has already approved of himself. He doesn't chase her validation because his psychological center remains unmoved by external circumstances. This isn't cruelty. This is psychological wholeness expressing itself in masculine form. The woman finds herself drawn to the shadow figure not because she enjoys suffering, but because she recognizes in him something her deepest nature seeks, a psychological superior, someone operating from a place of inner abundance rather than inner scarcity. Her unconscious whispers, "Here stands a man who doesn't need me," which means his choice to be with me carries genuine value. This recognition triggers what Jung observed about the anima's deepest longing, not to be possessed, but to be chosen by someone who could just as easily choose otherwise. The psychological mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. We value what is scarce and dismiss what is abundant. When you make your attention scarce, it becomes precious. When you offer it freely without condition, it becomes worthless. Watch how this dynamic plays out in the theater of modern romance. The man who responds immediately to every message signals that he has nothing more pressing than her communication. The man who sometimes takes days to respond suggests a life so full and purposeful that her message, while welcome, doesn't disrupt his psychological center. One behavior communicates scarcity, the other suggests abundance. The woman's unconscious performs constant calculations about your relative value position. Are you grateful for her attention, or selective about whom you give yours to? Do you rearrange your world to accommodate her schedule, or invite her to join the fascinating world you've already created? Do you seek her approval for your choices, or make decisions from your own center of psychological authority? These calculations happen beyond conscious awareness, processed by psychological mechanisms that evolved when survival itself depended on choosing the right mate. Her attraction isn't based on your conscious qualities, your job, your appearance, your stated intentions, but on the subtle energy you emit about your own self-worth. The man who needs her approval radiates psychological hunger. The man who appreciates but doesn't require her presence radiates psychological fullness. One energy repels, the other attracts. The distinction isn't moral but mechanical, operating according to laws as reliable as any force in nature. This is why the nice guy phenomenon mystifies so many well-intentioned men. They confuse being good with being attractive, not realizing these exist on entirely different psychological planes. Goodness relates to conscious values and moral choices. Attraction relates to unconscious assessments of strength, abundance, and psychological superiority. If this psychological archaeology is revealing hidden chambers in your understanding of attraction, and you're beginning to see the invisible forces that have been shaping your romantic experiences, subscribe now. Because what I'm about to reveal about the specific psychological triggers that activate a woman's deepest attraction will fundamentally alter how you approach every interaction with feminine. The shadow work required for masculine attraction involves embracing what Jung called inferior function, those aspects of yourself that society has taught you to suppress. Society tells you to be accommodating, always available, eager to please. But the unconscious respond to the opposite energy, selectivity, mysterious depth, and the quiet confidence of a man who is individuated beyond the need for external validation. This isn't about adopting a false persona of indifference, but about discovering the authentic self that naturally embodies these qualities. When you stop seeking her approval and start seeking your own, when you stop trying to impress and start expressing your genuine nature, when you stop chasing and start choosing, then you align with the archetypal forces that have governed attraction since humanity began. The psychological territory we now enter requires us to examine one of Jung's most profound insights, the principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite when taken to extremes. In the realm of romantic attraction, this principle manifests with startling precision. The more desperately a man pursues, the more surely he activates a woman's unconscious retreat. The more he demonstrates his availability, the more her psyche categorizes him as psychologically inferior. This seeming paradox becomes comprehensible when we understand that the feminine psyche operates according to what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold tension between opposites until a new psychological position emerges. A woman's attraction system doesn't respond to simple, predictable stimuli, but to the creative tension generated by uncertainty itself. When you become completely predictable, calling at identical intervals, responding with consistent enthusiasm, following the same behavioral patterns, you collapse this creative tension. Her unconscious mind completes its assessment of your psychological territory and finds no further mystery to explore. The transcendent function ceases to operate because there are no longer opposites to reconcile, no uncertainty to resolve, no psychological riddle requiring her mental energy to solve. Consider how the shadow operates in this dynamic. The shadow contains all the qualities we've been taught to repress. In this case, the masculine capacity for emotional independence, selective availability, and what Jung called holy selfishness. Most men have been conditioned to view these qualities as negative, to suppress their natural tendency towards psychological autonomy in favor of accommodating behaviors that feel safer but communicate weakness. The man who has integrated his shadow doesn't need to perform indifference. He naturally emanates the energy of someone who has other compelling interests, other sources of fulfillment, other options for how to spend his precious life force. This isn't calculated strategy, but authentic wholeness expressing itself. He doesn't ignore her messages out of manipulation, but because he's genuinely engaged with pursuits that matter to him beyond romantic conquest. This integration of shadow qualities creates what Jung called psychological inflation in reverse. Instead of becoming grandiose about his importance, he becomes genuinely unattached to outcomes. Instead of needing her to validate his worth, he operates from an internal sense of value that requires no external confirmation. This psychological position generates what the unconscious recognizes as true strength. The feminine unconscious performs sophisticated value assessments through what we might call archetypal pattern recognition. When she encounters a man who seems grateful for her attention, her psyche categorizes him according to ancient templates: the supplicant, the grateful recipient, the one who receives rather than chooses. These archetypes carry millennia of evolutionary associations with lower survival value. But when she encounters a man who seems to be evaluating whether she's worthy of his continued interest, different archetypal patterns activate. The king, the selector, the one who has abundance and therefore can afford to be choosy. These archetypes trigger entirely different psychological responses, activating what Jung observed about the anima's deepest longing, to be chosen by someone whose choice carries genuine weight. The psychological mechanism Jung called projection plays a crucial role here. When a woman is uncertain about your interest level, she begins projecting her own desired qualities onto you. The gaps in her knowledge about your feelings become spaces where her imagination constructs an idealized version of who you might be. This projection process generates powerful emotional investment, as she becomes attracted not just to who you are, but to who she imagines you could be. The man who reveals everything immediately eliminates this projection space. There's no mystery for her unconscious to fill with fantasy, no uncertainty for her imagination to resolve with idealized scenarios. He becomes a known quantity, and known quantities rarely maintain their psychological fascination. This principle explains a magnetic pull of what society labels a bad boy archetype. It's not that women consciously desire poor treatment, but that these men naturally embody the archetypal qualities that trigger deep attraction. Psychological independence, emotional unavailability that create projection space, and behavior that suggests they have other options. They haven't been conditioned out of their natural masculine shadow qualities. The psychological tests that women unconsciously administer serve a profound purpose. They're attempting to gauge your psychological resilience under pressure. When she mentions another man's attractiveness, she's not seeking jealousy but observing whether you'll maintain your psychological center or become reactive. When she cancels plans, she's testing whether you will demonstrate scarcity mentality through disappointment or abundance mentality through easy acceptance. These tests operate according to what Jung called the individuation process. Her unconscious need to determine whether you've achieved psychological wholeness or remain dependent on external validation for your emotional stability. The man who passes these tests demonstrates that his psychological center cannot be moved by a behavior, which signals a kind of unshakable strength that deep feminine nature finds irresistible. The concept Jung called the wounded healer applies here in unexpected ways. The man who has done his psychological work, who has faced his own neediness and transcended it, naturally emanates a kind of self-contained energy that attracts. He is not performing indifference. He is genuinely comfortable with solitude, genuinely engaged with his own growth, genuinely unattached to any particular outcome with her. This psychological position creates what we might call attractive paradox. The more genuinely you don't need her, the more she wants to be needed by you. The more comfortable you become with the possibility of her leaving, the more invested she becomes in staying. The more you approve of yourself without requiring her validation, the more desperately she wants to earn your approval. The shadow work required involves embracing what Jung called the divine masculine principle, not the toxic caricature of dominance, but the authentic capacity for psychological independence, clear decision-making, and emotional self-sufficiency. This isn't about becoming cold, but about becoming so psychologically whole that you relate from choice rather than need, from abundance rather than scarcity, from strength rather than desperation. When you operate from this integrated position, several transformations occur simultaneously. Your behavior naturally becomes less predictable because you're responding from authentic impulses rather than calculated strategies. Your emotional investment becomes more balanced because you're not afraid of loss. Your communication becomes more selective because you have other compelling interests demanding your attention. If you're recognizing patterns in your own behavior that have been unconsciously sabotaging your romantic success, and you want to understand a specific technique for integrating these shadow qualities into your authentic masculine presence, make sure you're subscribed, because in our final section, I'll reveal the exact psychological practices that will transform you from someone who chases attraction into someone who naturally generates it. The deepest transformation occurs when we understand that Jung's concept of individuation applies not just to personal growth, but to the very structure of romantic desire itself. The individuated man doesn't try to attract women. He naturally attracts them as a byproduct of his psychological wholeness. This distinction marks the difference between manipulation and authentic magnetism, between performing attraction and embodying it. The process begins with what Jung called withdrawing projections, ceasing to make the woman responsible for your emotional well-being, your sense of worth, or your happiness. Most men unconsciously project the archetypal mother onto their romantic interests, seeking from them the unconditional approval and nurturing they desire. This projection immediately places a woman in a superior psychological position, which her unconscious recognizes and responds to with diminished attraction. When you withdraw these projections, something profound happens. You begin relating to her as she actually is rather than as a fulfillment of your psychological needs. This shift creates space for what Jung called genuine encounter, meeting another person from your own center rather than from your wounds. Women can sense this difference immediately, and it generates a kind of respect that forms a foundation of deep attraction. The psychological principle of compensation reveals why traditional dating advice fails so catastrophically. When you try to compensate for feelings of inadequacy through external improvements, better clothes, more money, physical fitness, you're addressing surface symptoms while leaving the core psychological imbalance untouched. The needy energy remains unchanged, merely dressed in better packaging. True transformation requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. You must simultaneously care about her while remaining emotionally independent, show interest while maintaining your own center, be available while preserving your autonomy. This psychological position can only be maintained by someone who has done the inner work of individuation. The shadow integration process involves recognizing and embracing those aspects of masculine nature that society has taught you to suppress. The capacity to say no, to prioritize your own needs, to remain unmoved by emotional manipulation, to choose based on your own criteria rather than her approval. These aren't cruel qualities, but necessary ones for psychological wholeness. Consider how the individuation process creates natural abundance mentality. When you're genuinely engaged with your own growth, pursuing meaningful work, developing your capacities, and building a life of substance, you naturally develop what Jung called psychological wealth. This inner abundance eliminates neediness not through effort but through genuine fulfillment. The man operating from this position doesn't need to calculate when to respond to messages. He responds when it feels authentic to do so. He doesn't need to strategize about maintaining mystery. His genuine interests and pursuits naturally create it. He doesn't need to perform indifference. His psychological wholeness generates it organically. This authenticity creates what we might call unconscious communication, the transmission of your psychological state through subtle energy rather than overt behavior. Women possess extraordinary sensitivity to these unconscious communications. They can sense desperation beneath confident words, neediness beneath generous gestures, scarcity beneath abundant resources. Conversely, they can recognize authentic abundance, genuine confidence, and psychological wholeness even when expressed quietly. The archetypal dimension reveals why this approach works across cultures and throughout history. The psychological patterns we're describing aren't cultural constructs, but expressions of what Jung called a collective unconscious, universal patterns of human attraction that transcend social conditioning. The woman's unconscious recognizes authentic masculine wholeness regardless of how it's packaged culturally. Frame control, from a Jungian perspective, represents your relationship with your own psychological center. When you maintain frame, you're not controlling her but maintaining your connection to your own truth, your own values, your own reality. This psychological centeredness creates what Jung observed about natural authority, leadership that emerges from inner conviction rather than external force. The tests women administer serve the individuation process for both parties. For her, they determine whether you've achieved psychological wholeness or remain reactive to external circumstances. For you, they provide opportunities to practice maintaining your center under pressure, strengthening your capacity for what Jung called holding space, remaining psychologically present without becoming emotionally entangled. The concept of psychological investment reveals itself as fundamentally about energy direction. The man who overinvests emotionally is directing his life force toward obtaining something external, her approval, her presence, her validation. The integrated man invests his energy primarily in his own development, sharing the overflow with those who demonstrate worthiness through their own psychological wholeness. This creates what Jung recognized as authentic masculine polarity, not the domination of feminine energy, but the provision of psychological structure within which feminine energy can safely express itself. Women are drawn to this dynamic because it allows them to relax into their own nature rather than having to provide the psychological stability that should come from masculine presence. The transformation from neediness to abundance isn't achieved through suppression of desire, but through its proper channeling. When your primary desire becomes your own individuation, your own growth, development, and self-realization, romantic relationships become expressions of choice rather than need. You don't seek a woman to complete you, but to complement your already complete existence. This psychological position creates what we might call attractive detachment, caring without clinging, loving without possessing, choosing without desperation. The woman recognizes in this energy something her deepest nature seeks, a man who could survive without her but chooses to include her, someone whose life will continue meaningfully even as she departed. The practical application involves daily practices that strengthen psychological wholeness, meditation that connects you to your own center, creative pursuits that express your unique gifts, physical practices that ground you in your body, intellectual development that expands your consciousness, and service that connects you to purposes larger than personal gratification. These practices naturally generate the psychological qualities that women find irresistible, emotional stability that can't be shaken by her moods, psychological depth that maintains her interest, life purpose that doesn't revolve around her, and authentic confidence that doesn't require her validation. The final paradox reveals itself. When you no longer need to attract women, you naturally become attractive. When you stop seeking their approval, they begin seeking yours. When you cease chasing them, they begin pursuing you. This isn't strategy, but the inevitable result of psychological wholeness expressing itself in the realm of romantic relationships. The journey toward this authentic masculine presence requires commitment to your own individuation process, but the rewards extend far beyond romantic success to every area of your life. Share in the comments below. Which psychological pattern do you recognize most clearly in your own relationship experiences? Your honest reflection not only helps your own growth, but provides valuable insights to other men undertaking the same transformative journey toward authentic masculine wholeness.